Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the Heart-Based Business Show. We are here every Wednesday, and I am so grateful that you do participate when we are having the show. And I'd love to have your comments. Please subscribe, share the information with your friends, and you are really going to enjoy today's show because we are going to talk about the transgender population and how they interact in the business world with their families and how to interact best with them. And I'm going to love this advice because I've known so many transgendered people that I really, really enjoyed. They have such great personalities. And if you can just think of them as their soul, it's all good. So this gentleman that we're going to talk to today has been, well, he began his transgender shift in 2012. And he's been empowering young adults through stories to live their life on their own terms more quickly and easily than he did. Because I can imagine when you're looking back at 2012 and before, it wasn't readily accepted, but now it is. And I love it because we're just accepting the soul into our lives. It has nothing to do with gender or who anybody really is, their color, their race, nothing. It just has to do with their soul. And if we could always look at a person's soul, you'll find that it really doesn't matter who is being presented to you, because the person that is in front of you is just a person like you. Now, this gentleman was a regular contributor to Autism Empowerment in 2009 and recently appeared on Chat and Spin Radio in the United Kingdom. And he writes both fiction and nonfiction to encourage and empower young people. And his latest novel is Reinventing Hannah. And he was named as a semi-finalist in 2020 in the Kindle Book Awards. That's a really big deal. You know that if you've ever had a Kindle Book Award. So today we're going to be talking about the way to empower transgender people in their families and how to relate with them in the business world. I'd like to introduce to you Jack Ori. Hi, Jack. Welcome to the show. I'm really happy that you're here with me to talk about this because it's such an important topic.
Hi, Shirlene. So glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's a delight. So, Jack, tell me how all this got started for you. I think that's a question that almost everybody wants an answer to.
Sure. So I'm just going to give you the Reader's Digest version because I don't want to take too much time. But the short version is that I pretty much, as a kid, knew that I felt different. I knew I felt like a boy and not a girl. But as a kid, I didn't really understand that because in the 80s, 90s, it wasn't talked about. And so I grew up thinking I must be a girl because the adults said so. What's wrong with me? And then I explored it a little bit as I grew older. When I went to college, I would use like a male persona on online forums, which were starting to become popular around that time. It was like the internet was new, all those things. And then eventually when I was in my 30s and I began helping a friend with her gender transition, it helped me think more seriously about mine and start thinking about, I wonder who I am, and to start experimenting with going out in public dressed as male and seeing how that felt, and realizing that people still saw me as female and not really being happy about that, and trying to figure out what my next steps were and all those kinds of things.
Well, a lot of females dress as males, not even necessarily transgender. But how did that feel to you?
So for me, it was very liberating, but also very frustrating. Like, I would wear men's clothes. I would wear like a men's button-down shirt, and I would wear men's dress slacks, and I would have I didn't have a beard then, obviously, because I hadn't started my medical transition, but I would have a short haircut, and I would walk into a restaurant and people would be like, "How you doing, ma'am?" And it would be like, that would be annoying. And so, um, and so that was kind of annoying and frustrating. But there was one time where I went to buy clothes, and I went into the men's department at Marshall's, and I picked out men's clothes, and I went to the dressing rooms, and then they have in the front of the fitting room one person sitting there to tell you men's room this way, women's room that way, and the woman said, "Oh, men's room is right there," and that made me feel like so good that I didn't really care that the cashier called me ma'am, because like somebody in this store got it right. So
Exactly. Yes. So as you were going through this transition, how long did it actually take the transition for you?
well, I would say it's pretty much an evolving process, but at this point I've been on hormones since 2012, so it's going 9 years this month in a couple of weeks. So and then it's a lifelong thing because you're always figuring out who you are and how you want to express yourself. But I do feel like the first 4 or 5 years were really like a second adolescence, where it's like, okay, how do I want to dress? What name do I want to use? How do I want? What kind of presentation do I want? Who do I want? What do I want to look like? What do I want to do with my life? All those things that you usually start experimenting with, like in high school or college. I felt like I was doing that all over again.
Wow, that's hard. Hard because I went to college. It was hard enough going to college without trying to transition into becoming a man. That's
Right.
on top of it, it's so much more difficult. And
Right.
a lot of times I feel a lot of heart for transgendered people because I know that they have to go through so much in order to become who they believe they are. And
Right.
then there's the rest of the world that goes, that you have to
Right.
deal with on top of it. So it's like an added layer that a lot of people don't have to deal with.
Right, exactly. It is very difficult because there's so much around us. And I think people too don't always realize how gender is ingrained into our society. Like there are a lot of things you don't think about. Like pretty much anything you do, any kind of business, or whether it's medical or something else, if you're filling out a form, usually it's going to ask male or female, right? Like it's going to ask on the forms what your gender is, or even and the example that well known in our culture is which bathroom do you use, because that's something that's debated a lot in certain areas of the country. So
Right.
there's all sorts of things that are going on that we don't even think about. Like if you don't know a transgender person, you don't have a transgender person in your life, or you're not transgender yourself, you probably don't even think about it. Like it's probably natural, like to be like, oh, okay, I'm gonna have an intake form, I can put what gender, male, female, on my intake form for whatever reason.
So what do you put? What do you
So
put?
very often, if there's a space for transgender, I will put that, or sometimes some forms will say other, so I will sometimes put that.
Other.
Some forms
Okay.
will say prefer not to say, and then I'll just use that because I don't really fit into either one. Like if I have to, if just male and female on there, I'll usually put male because that's how I identify. But it doesn't fully feel right because I feel like doesn't doesn't really encompass all of who I am. And especially if it's something medical, I feel like then the person does need to know certain things, because if you're going to a doctor, they need to know, like, okay, this person is male, but they might have some issues that we usually associate with women, or
True.
something like that.
Yeah, I get it. So you just put male until you
Yeah.
get in the back room with the doctor or whatever, right?
Right.
Yeah, I could see how that would be very, very confusing. So you work with families, and when somebody comes out to a family, how do they deal with that? I know that you help a lot of them. What do you tell them?
Right. Like one of the things I talk to families about a lot is the idea of being patient with themselves, and it is an adjustment, because a lot of times one of the big issues that comes up is the transgender child will say, I want to be called by this name or by this pronoun. So don't call me by female pronouns anymore. Don't call me by the name that you gave me anymore. For the parent, that can be difficult for a couple of reasons. One, because they're used to it. Like
That's true.
when you have a child and it's 15 years, 20 years, or in my case 33 years that you've been calling them by a certain name and pronoun, it's just a habit that it takes time to break and change. So and then there's also a lot of times parents do have this mourning process because they feel like, especially if, like, my birth name, I was named after my grandfather who died before I was born. So, so for me to change that name for my parents would have to be like, well, but now we gave you that name for a reason, like, so that can be difficult for parents as well. Or sometimes a parent will feel like, I had a son and now I have a daughter. I have a daughter, now I have a son. And it's kind of this sadness that they have to work through. So some of what I help parents with is teaching them to, number one, be patient with themselves and realize it is a process, that it's going to take time for them to make these changes, and to keep trying, keep the lines of communication open with their child. And a lot of what I teach them also is active listening, because it's very easy for parents and children to get into this, like, fighting with each other mode, where it's like the parent says this and the child says, I hate that you're doing that, and the parent says, well, I'm the parent. And you could go around in circles. So to break that up, I teach active listening. I teach them to put their feelings aside for a moment, focus on what the other person is saying, and then paraphrase, repeat it back to make sure they've got it right. And then there will be time for you to talk about your feelings, but first make sure that you're hearing your child, so that helps the child feel heard, and it also helps break up that pattern of that back and forth.
So, how do you feel about? I'm going to ask you a political question, if I may. Would that be
Sure.
okay? How
Sure.
do you feel about this transgender situation with girls' sports and that kind of thing? What is your thought?
So my thought on this is that there are a couple of different things. One is that, to an extent, I understand the concern of, well, this person has testosterone, they might be a different weight class or whatever. And if it's a
Yeah.
sport where that makes a difference, that is something that does have to be dealt with in some way. But I also feel it's important for kids to be able to be on the sports team that reflects their gender identity. And what ends up happening is that a lot of times, transgender kids can't be on either team because, well, they look like a girl, but they were assigned male at birth, but they're too small, or they look like a girl, so they can't really fit on the boys' team, but they can't fit on the girls' team because they're taking hormones, which, especially if young kids, is not really going to be an issue because you can't take cross-gender hormones until you're 16, I think. So with the younger kids, it's really not an issue that you have to worry about. So especially on the younger kids teams, I think that's really important. I do think, something should be worked out about there being gender neutral locker rooms and whatnot as well, because that's also a concern of, both for the transgender child and the cisgender kids, that some transgender kids, they're not going to feel comfortable changing in front of their peers either, because they have different anatomy.
Right.
That's going to be
Right.
that can be
Especially in the
uncomfortable for
showers,
everyone,
right?
right? So that can be uncomfortable for everybody. So,
Yeah.
so it's not to say that there aren't some concerns that need to be worked out to figure out how to do it, but I think that this whole blanket "don't let them" is a problem.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's going to be a problem all the way along, especially when, men have that testosterone, so they're so much stronger, and their stamina is usually a lot longer than a woman. So it's hard to compete against a male body that isn't. You know what I mean by that? Is that making
Yeah,
sense?
yeah, that makes
Yeah,
sense. And I do
yeah.
think, and I think, like I said, I think it's also, um, I think there should be a distinction made between, like, adult sports teams and kids sports teams as well, because with kids, a lot of times, when you're talking about young kids, nobody's on hormones. So, you know, so that's a different situation. Like, kid who's in third grade playing soccer is not going to be on testosterone or
Yeah.
estrogen. So that's not a concern with that. And then I
Hmm.
think, figuring out how they're going to, and I think it might require reclassification of how they do some sports, because instead of separating by gender, maybe they can separate by, like, their different strength classes or different levels of stamina. Like this team is for people who have higher endurance. This team is for people who have lower endurance or something,
That's
to be
actually a
reimagined
brilliant
that way.
idea. Yeah, that's a brilliant idea. Maybe like they do with wrestling, put them in the class
Right.
categories then, based
Right.
on their
Yeah.
achievement.
Yeah, because there are cisgender people who are higher or lower in testosterone as well. There are women who have more testosterone naturally than other women, or vice versa.
Yes,
So,
you're right. You're very right. Some are very feminine and some are not so feminine. So I know
right.
exactly what
So,
you're talking about.
right. So,
Yeah.
so you don't have to be transgender to have higher testosterone. So,
Yes.
so
Now, would you say that I know they're going back and forth over whether they should let young kids do the transgender hormones and all of that. Do you think, I was reading not too long ago about a boy, you probably, actually, I saw it on YouTube about a boy that had gone all the way and then he decided he didn't want to do that after it was too late. What are your thoughts
right.
on that?
Okay, so two things. One, detransitioning is really rare. So I think that the media likes to make a big deal out of those kinds of cases and be like, look, this person changed their mind, but it doesn't really happen very often. And the other thing is to be aware of that there are different levels of transition. And I don't know the laws in other countries, but I imagine many of them are similar. I know in the US, kids can't take cross-gender hormones till they're 16 and they can't have surgery till they're 18. And those are the two things that can be permanent. So
Okay.
for the rest of it, the choice a lot of parents have is hormone blockers, which is it's a medication that a prepubescent child can take that basically stops puberty from starting.
Mm.
And that is reversible. So if a child is taking this medication and then they change their mind and they say, you know what, I'm not transgendered. I really am a boy. I really am a girl. You just stop the medication and their puberty will be later than their peers because they didn't start at the same time. But they can still catch up. They'll still get their deep voice and body hair and everything else if they're male, or their period and their breasts and everything if they're female. So for that, so that's not as big a concern as people think. I think sometimes, a lot of times, I've heard people be like, "Oh, I didn't know those weren't permanent." Like, so I
Mm.
think that's a big concern, and I always like to tell people, no, that's something that can be reversed. If you and your child decide it's not right for you, you take them off the medication, and puberty will begin. So.
Now, does it happen pretty quickly when you're taking the hormones?
Um, though it depends on the person because genetics are all different. So some people react like I reacted quickly. I think as soon as I started taking testosterone, my voice started to change. I started to get a little bit of facial hair. Within 6 months, I had a full beard, but not everyone is that way. I remember I was at the LGBT clinic one day, and this other guy came up to me and he was like, oh, I'm a trans guy too. I've been on hormones for like 3 years. I'm wondering how long did it take for you to get your beard? So I didn't want to tell him 6 months because I didn't want him to feel
He'd be
discouraged.
depressed.
so I was just like, it took a while, and I just left it at that because I just basically tried to tell him it'll happen for you, but because it depends on the person, and sure, some people, unfortunately, it does take longer, and that can be frustrating for them because they're like, I really want this to happen, but it's the same as natural natural puberty. If you're cisgender, some kids will be fully developed at 13, and other kids will be 16 and not really have facial hair. So
Yeah. Yes. So, what do you think about transgender in business? Do you think it comes up often, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think it probably comes up more often than you'd think because when I was doing my social work internship, I actually had the opportunity to give some talks to my company about transgender issues because we had a lot of transgender clients. And so my boss was like, oh, you're transgender. This would be great so that everyone knows how to talk to their transgender clients and how to help them and so forth. And I think that happens in a lot of businesses because you just never know, number one, if you're any kind of service-based business, you never know who's going to come through the door who's transgender. And
Yes.
you never know who you're working with who either is transgender themselves or they know somebody who is. And even though it's not something that's talked about as much on the news or in media, it is something that I think a lot of businesses struggle to address, because especially one issue that comes up a lot is somebody decides to start transitioning after they start a job, right? So you're already on the job, people know you as your birth gender and by this name and by this gender, and then the person decides, I want to start transitioning, and then there are a lot of issues that could come up with that. Like, number one, like even feeling comfortable to say to your boss, this is what I'm going to be doing, it could be an issue. Or then there's the issue, how do you introduce it to coworkers? How do you introduce it to does your boss want to do you want to have a meeting and just tell everyone, or do you feel like it's something you want to tell people on a case-by-case basis? And then also, as always, the whole issue of which bathroom is this employee going to use, because they're known as one gender and now they're transitioning to the other gender. And I think the goal with that is to make everybody as comfortable as possible, but also make sure you're supporting the transgender person, because as a business, the last thing you want is for an employee who's considering transition, who is transitioning, or who is transgender, to be like, everyone was uncomfortable with it, I felt uncomfortable with these people, then that's not going to be a good situation. Right. And depending on your state laws, also you have to know what your anti-discrimination statutes are, and like what, as a supervisor, you have to provide for this person, because everything is different in different states. Unfortunately, there are some states where someone could be like, you know what, I don't want you because you're transgender, you're fired, and that's another issue.
Do they do that?
I think that there are a lot of states that have what's called at-will employment, and I think it's something like 38 states don't have any law on the books saying you can't discriminate, so that's up to the employer. But I will tell you, when I working in North Carolina, which was one of the states that's at will and doesn't have any, or didn't have any laws at the time that I was there, every employer I worked for had a policy saying we do not discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity. So I think just because it's not legal, just because it's legal to, doesn't mean it'll happen. But it is something that people should be aware of, because if you're transgender, you know that in your state you don't have any legal recourse if you're fired because of it. That can impact your decisions.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. So what's the best way to talk to a transgender person when you're working or in business?
So definitely, I mean, for the most part, you want to talk to like you would anyone else, So it's easier to say what not to do than what to do, because
okay, tell me what not to do.
So like one thing that came up when I was giving these seminars, these talks, is I would have some coworkers who thought they were being nice and being kind and being supportive, would be like, I would have never guessed you were transgender, And for a transgender person, that's not really a compliment, because it's almost like they're saying you're okay because you seem like a real guy or a real girl or whatever, a real woman. So you don't want to say that. You don't want to say things like that. And you don't want to ask questions that are really, really super personal, like you wouldn't call it, like you don't want to ask a transgender person that you've just met, like, hey, so you're transgender, what surgeries have you had?
Do people ask that right off the bat?
Sometimes some people do. I haven't experienced it too much, but I've heard some of my other transgender friends have talked about that a lot, that people will be like at a dinner party or something, find out they're transgender, they're asking them these really personal questions. So you want to not do that. And I think the key is always to think about, like, would I ask this of someone who's not transgender? And if it's something that would be embarrassing or awkward or really not very nice, don't do it with a transgender person either. And I think it's interesting, because one of the things that comes up a lot when I tell people I'm transgender is a lot of times people will be like, oh, do you mind if I ask you a question? And it won't be anything like that. Like, I always expect it to be something like that, but a lot of times people will be like, I've never met anyone who's transgender before. Can you explain more about what it was like for you or something? Or once I was at the DMV when I changed my name, and the DMV worker said, "Oh, can I ask you a question?" And I thought, this is again in North Carolina, so I thought, oh, she's gonna like go off on some rant or something and be like, "Why did you change your gender or something?" And she was like, "Oh, your middle name is Asher. That's my nephew's name. I was wondering what that name means." So
Not what you expected at all.
I was like, that's a much better topic of conversation than what I was expecting.
Right, right. And sometimes you get what you expect, right?
You're
So
right.
maybe not expecting
Right, yeah. So, yeah,
that.
and it can be hard to like keep that positive mindset because there is so much discrimination, and especially like, one of the things I asked my group today is how's everyone doing, because there was a law that was just passed in Arkansas saying that you can't give any kind of hormone blockers or anything else to transgender kids, and for transgender people this is very upsetting.
Yeah.
And it amounts to discrimination because there are some procedures or whatnot that they would give to a cisgender child that they're like, oh, you're transgender, you can't have it. So, and
Hmm.
so that kind of thing, it can be hard to stay positive, and it's important to acknowledge those things and to talk about them and to talk about the effect it has on you and not just try to be like, I'm going to be having tunnel vision and just be positive all the time. But at the same time, try to not expect the worst of everybody, which can be challenging.
Now, you mentioned your group. Tell us a little bit about your group.
Yes. So it's a support network for parents of transgender kids. And my vision in creating this group is number one, to give parents answers that they need, because there's a lot of parents who have kids who are transgender who don't know what to do, and there's not a lot of information out there. So I post questions. I do a Facebook Live on a topic every week where I talk about what to do, how to approach the discussions of puberty with your child, what to do if you're concerned that your child may have a mental health issue, all sorts of things, depending on what the group needs. And right now we have 90 people, I think. So, parents are also welcome to post their questions, and they get support from each other. They get support from me. And I always give people the opportunity, if they want to go deeper, they can always also work with me one-on-one, and get to know me in the group first, so that they can see like how I can help and how I can make things a little bit easier for them and their families.
Wow, that's awesome. So, any of you who are transgendered or know of someone who is, I posted there for the group. Go to the group so that Jack can help you if you need support. It'll be really good for the family also. So, Jack, I know you have a book.
Yes.
So, tell us a little bit about your book. Do you have it there with you?
Yes, I do. This is
Good.
actually a proof copy. Your copy will not have not for resale on it. But this is Reinventing Hannah. And even though it's not transgender specific, I think that the topic is one that both transgender and cisgender people can relate to, because it's basically about personal transformation. It's about a 16-year-old girl who has been holding herself back because her mother is bipolar, and she's afraid she's of being bipolar too. So the first time she decides not to hold herself back and goes to a party with a friend, unfortunately, her drink is drugged and she is sexually assaulted, and she doesn't remember the next day. And as she goes through the process of dealing with what happened to her, she starts making a lot of changes in her life, and she starts deciding she doesn't want to be the quiet girl that her friends call Mouse anymore. She wants to be someone who stands up for herself. She wants to be someone who stands up for other survivors. And she struggles with that, and she struggles with how her friends react to the way that she has changed. And she has her own internal stuff going on between the part of her that wants to be Mouse and wants to be quiet, and the part of her that's like, no, I want to go out and do things and speak up and be who I'm really meant to be. So throughout the story, she learns to step more into her authentic self.
Wow. So that would be a great book for parents and the kids to pick up,
Yes,
right?
yes,
Yeah.
definitely. It's something that I know at least one person who said, I bought this for my daughter and I'm going to read it too, so that then we can talk about it.
Yeah. And it would bring them closer because there'd be a better understanding for both sides, correct?
Yes, yes.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, Jack, I so appreciate that you've been here with me to give this information to our audience. I appreciate that you took the time and that you are so open to talking about this, because I know it helps a tremendous amount of people that desperately need the help.
Also, I'm glad to be able to be here. Thank you so much.
So, everyone, I hope you really enjoyed that information that you just received. As I said a little earlier, please, if you are transgendered or if you have a challenge with someone that is transgendered themselves, Jack is a great person to connect with so that you can get things worked out. And he could probably even sit the two of you down together and show you a way to work things out. And sometimes that even works better. And I want to say thank you so much for joining me today. It's been wonderful, and I hope to see you again next week. Bye-bye.